At the family barbecue, my brother's son said, "Charity cases eat last," and they all giggled. I put my plate down and walked out. That night, Dad texted, "The business needs your investment." I replied, "Never again." The next morning, one notice went out, and their laughter turned to tears. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Since we are stepping into 2026, I want to wish everyone a year of strength and clarity. I really hope you continue to support this channel as we share these stories. The humidity at the lake house wasn't just weather, it was an atmosphere. It pressed down on the Vanguard Logistics 40th anniversary garden party like a wet wool blanket, trapping the smell of expensive cologne and the clinking of crystal glasses in the heavy air. My parents, Joseph and Susan, had spent $50,000 to turn the lawn into a showroom of their success. White tents, a string quartet sweating in their tuxedos, and enough seafood to feed a small navy. It was performative wealth at its finest, a stage designed to convince the investors that the company was thriving, even though I knew the balance sheet said otherwise. I stood on the periphery, holding a glass of lukewarm water. That was my place in the family geometry, always on the edge, essential for the head count but irrelevant to the conversation. My brother, Christopher, the chief operating officer, was holding court near the open bar. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my first car, laughing too loudly at a joke made by a potential client. His wife, Morgan, stood beside him, her smile fixed and bright, scanning the crowd for anyone more important to talk to. I was hungry. I hadn't eaten since breakfast because I'd spent the morning reviewing the portfolio adjustments for my actual clients, the ones who knew I managed $200 million in assets, not the family who thought I was a back-office paper pusher. I walked toward the buffet tables. The spread was impressive. Lobster tails, oysters on the half-shell, towers of shrimp. I reached for a plate. That was when Mason, Christopher's 12-year-old son, stepped in front of me. He didn't bump into me, he blocked me. He stood guard over the chilled prawns with a smirk that was a carbon copy of his father's. He looked me up and down, his eyes bright with the permission to be cruel that he'd absorbed from the adults around him. "Dad says charity cases eat last," he announced. His voice wasn't a whisper. It carried over the low hum of the string quartet. A few guests nearby turned their heads. I looked past Mason to Christopher. My brother had heard it. He looked right at me, took a sip of his scotch, and smirked. He didn't correct his son. He didn't apologize. He validated it with his silence. My parents, standing 10 feet away, suddenly found the floral arrangements fascinating. In that moment, time didn't stop, but my perspective shifted. I didn't feel the sting of tears or the flush of embarrassment I usually felt. Instead, I felt a cold, terrifying clarity. People think family trauma is a sudden break, a single event that shatters everything. It isn't. It is a bank account. For 31 years, I had been making deposits into a bank of tolerance. I deposited my silence when they forgot my graduation. I deposited my dignity when they mocked my boring job. I deposited my pride every time they treated me like an obligation they couldn't quite shake off. I had been paying compound interest on their disrespect, assuming that someday, if I paid enough, I would buy their love. But looking at a child sneering at me with my brother's face, I realized the ledger was full. The account was overdrawn. There was no more credit to extend. I wasn't sad. I was simply done doing business with them. "Understood," I said softly. I set the empty plate back on the stack with a deliberate click. I didn't look at Christopher. I didn't look at my parents. I turned and walked toward the side gate. "Alyssa, don't be dramatic," Morgan called out, her voice shrill. "He's just a kid." I didn't answer. I kept walking. The gravel crunched under my heels, a satisfying final sound. I walked past the valet stand, past the rows of luxury cars, and got into my modest sedan. I sat there for a moment in the silence, the air conditioning blasting against the sweat on my neck. I checked my phone. No missed calls. No texts asking if I was okay. Just the silence I had always known. I put the car in gear and drove away. I wasn't just leaving a party. I was driving toward the biggest transaction of my life. The bank of trauma was closed, and tomorrow, I was calling in the debt. My apartment was 40 minutes away from the lake house, but it might as well have been on a different planet. It was a penthouse in the financial district, bought with cash 3 years ago. The air was cool and filtered, smelling of lemon verbena and silence. There were no family photos on the walls, just modern art and the city skyline glowing through floor-to-ceiling windows. This was the sanctuary I had built with the money they thought I didn't have, doing the job they thought I couldn't do. I kicked off my heels and poured a glass of water, my hand perfectly steady. Sociologists have a term for siblings like me. They call us glass children. We are the ones born healthy in families consumed by a sick child, or in my case, the ones born competent in a family consumed by a golden child. We aren't broken, so we aren't fixed. We aren't shiny, so we aren't displayed. We are just glass transparent, functional, looked through to see the things that actually matter. For 31 years, my parents had looked right through me to admire Christopher, who had failed the bar exam twice. Christopher, who needed a chief operating officer title to feel important. They polished him until he gleamed, never noticing that I was the structural integrity holding up the display case. They thought I was a portfolio assistant or a clerk, a boring paper pusher who balanced checkbooks. The truth was, I was a senior portfolio manager for a private wealth firm. I didn't balance checkbooks. I restructured estates. I didn't manage thousands. I managed hundreds of millions. My personal net worth was north of $20 million, accumulated through aggressive, high-risk trading in my 20s. But the biggest trade of my life and the worst had been Vanguard Logistics. I sat down at my desk, the mahogany cool under my fingertips. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed, illuminating the face of the woman they didn't know. 5 years ago, Vanguard Logistics had been technically bankrupt. My father, Joseph, had over-leveraged the fleet to buy Christopher a flashy downtown headquarters. The banks had called the loans. They were days away from liquidation. I remembered the dinner where my father wept into his scotch, terrified of the public shame. I couldn't watch them fall. I was the glass child. My function was to hold things together. So, I created a shell company. Ironclad Capital. Through a lawyer, I approached them as an anonymous angel investor. I injected $5.1 million of my own money into the firm. I paid off the toxic debt. I upgraded the fleet. I saved them. In exchange, Ironclad Capital took 37% equity and a silent board seat. They never asked who was behind the curtain. They were too busy celebrating their business genius for securing the funding. They took the money, patted themselves on the back, and went right back to treating me like furniture. I looked at the digital clock. 9:30 p.m. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Joseph. Alyssa, we need to talk tomorrow. The fleet expansion is over budget. We might need a small personal loan to bridge the gap until next quarter. Family helps family. I stared at the screen. A bridge loan. On top of the $5 million they didn't know I'd already given. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a liquidity provider. I didn't reply. I opened my secure email client and composed a new message to David, my attorney and the face of Ironclad Capital. Subject: Vanguard Logistics. Liquidity event. David. Effective immediately. Ironclad Capital is exercising its option under Section 4, Paragraph B of the shareholder agreement. We are formally requesting a full buyout of our 37% stake at current fair market value. If they cannot provide liquidity within 30 days, initiate the forced sale clause. There is no room for negotiation. Proceed. I hit send. The swoosh of the email leaving my outbox was the quietest sound in the room, but I knew it would land like a bomb. The glass child wasn't invisible anymore. I had just become the most visible problem in their lives. The next morning, the notice from Ironclad Capital hit my father's inbox at exactly 9 a.m. David didn't waste time. The letter was a masterclass in corporate brevity. It stated simply that the minority shareholder was exercising their liquidity rights. Vanguard Logistics had 30 days to produce $13.7 million in cash to buy out the stake, or the entire company would be put up for sale to the highest bidder. I was at my office, reviewing a merger for a tech client, when my phone started buzzing. I didn't answer. I let it vibrate against the mahogany desk, a rhythmic reminder that the chaos had begun. At noon, I called David. "It's pandemonium," David said, his voice calm and professional. "Your father called me 5 times in the last hour. He's claiming this is a hostile act. He's demanding to know who the investor is." I told him the investor prefers to remain silent, as per the original agreement. I also reminded him that the contract he signed 5 years ago, the one he didn't read closely because he was too busy celebrating the cash influx, is ironclad. I swiveled my chair to look out at the city. Do they have the money? Not even close. Their liquidity is tied up in Christopher's vanity projects. They tried to call their line of credit at the bank an hour ago. The bank froze them. Apparently, the rumor of a forced sale makes lenders nervous. I hung up. The trap was set. They were cornered. And like any trapped animal, they lashed out at the nearest available target. At 2 p.m., my father called me. I answered this time. "Alyssa," he said, his voice tight, vibrating with a stress he was trying desperately to hide. "We have a situation at the company. A minor administrative issue with an investor. A minor administrative issue." He was about to lose everything, and he was still spinning the narrative. "I'm busy, Dad. What do you need?" "We need a bridge loan," he said. "Just short term. The investor is being difficult, and we need to show some liquidity to the bank to get them to back off. We need $500,000. Today, the audacity was breathtaking. He was asking me for money to fight me. He wanted to use my own capital to stop me from collecting my own equity. "I can't do that, Dad," I said, my voice flat. "What do you mean you can't? You have that job in the city. You have savings. We're talking about the family legacy here, Alyssa. Christopher is beside himself. If we don't fix this, his children's future is at risk." There it was. Christopher's children. Mason, the boy who guarded the shrimp cocktail. The legacy of disrespect. "I don't have $500,000 to lend you," I lied. "And even if I did, I wouldn't lend it to a sinking ship." "Sinking ship?" His voice rose, the mask slipping. "How dare you? We built this. We gave you everything. You're being incredibly selfish, Alyssa. Family sticks together during a crisis. We don't abandon each other." "You abandoned me a long time ago, Dad," I said. "You just didn't notice because I was still useful." I hung up. 10 minutes later, a notification popped up on my social media feed. It was Morgan, my sister-in-law, a photo of her and Christopher looking stressed but brave, with a caption that read, "Hard times reveal true loyalty. Sad when people you thought you could count on forget where they came from. Family first fake people." I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel the urge to comment or defend myself. I just felt a cold sense of validation. They weren't reflecting on their mistakes. They were doubling down on their entitlement. They truly believed that my role on this earth was to subsidize their arrogance. They had no idea that the fake person they were insulting was the only person who could save them, and she had just decided to let them drown. The 30-day clock was ticking, and I was the one holding the stopwatch. The 30 days passed in a blur of escalating desperation. My father called me 7 times. Christopher showed up at my apartment building twice, but the doorman turned him away. I watched from my balcony as he yelled into his phone, pacing the sidewalk like a caged tiger. I imagined him calculating the cost of his suits versus the cost of his mortgage, realizing for the first time that the math didn't work without the company credit card. Finally, the deadline arrived. They had failed to raise the capital. The forced sale clause was triggered. Ironclad Capital moved quickly. They executed the sale of Vanguard Logistics to a private equity firm, a ruthless outfit known for stripping assets and maximizing efficiency. The deal was done. The papers were signed. My 37% stake was cashed out for $12.9 million. But there was one final piece of business. The closing meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Ironclad's headquarters on the 42nd floor. My family had been summoned to surrender the keys to the kingdom. David told me they were expecting to meet the faceless investors to negotiate their exit packages. They thought they were walking into a standard corporate handover. They were wrong. I arrived at 9:50. I was wearing a tailored black suit, my hair pulled back in a severe bun. I looked every inch the shark I had become. The receptionist, who knew exactly who I was, nodded and buzzed me through. I walked into the boardroom. My family was already there, huddled at the far end of the long mahogany table. Joseph looked gray, his shoulders slumped. Christopher was red-faced, arguing in a hushed whisper with Morgan. Susan was staring out the window, looking lost. When the door clicked shut behind me, they all looked up. "Alyssa?" Christopher asked, his voice a mix of confusion and annoyance. "What are you doing here? This is a private meeting. You can't be here." "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel, "I'm the only one who needs to be here." I walked to the head of the table. I pulled out the chairman's chair, and sat down. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. "What is this?" Joseph whispered. He looked from me to David, who was standing by the window with a file in his hands. "This," I said, "is the liquidity event you asked for?" "I don't understand," Susan said, her voice trembling. "Is me," I finished. "It always has been. The $5 million that saved this company 5 years ago? That was mine. The capital you used to buy the new fleet? Mine. The salary you paid yourself, Christopher, while mocking my boring job? Mine." Christopher stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "You're lying. You're a portfolio manager. You don't have that kind of money." "Sit down, Christopher," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The authority in my tone was absolute. He blinked, stunned, and slowly sat back down. "I managed high-risk assets for a decade," I said. "I built a fortune while you were building a facade, and when you needed saving, I saved you, anonymously. Because I knew if you knew it was me, you'd never respect the money. You'd treat it like an allowance." I opened the file in front of me. "But you didn't respect it anyway. You treated my capital like a personal piggy bank. And when you insulted me to my face, in front of your son, you breached the only contract that mattered." "We're family," Joseph pleaded, his eyes wet. "Alyssa, please. We can fix this. We can." "This isn't personal, Joseph," I said, echoing the words he had used 1,000 times to dismiss my feelings. "It's just business. And business is concluded. The company has been sold. The wire transfer hit my account this morning." "Sold?" Morgan gasped. "But what about Christopher's job? What about our shares?" "Your shares are being bought out at a discount due to the debt load," I said coldly. "And as for your jobs, the new owners will be conducting a full restructuring. I imagine the position of chief operating officer who does nothing will be the first to go." I stood up. I looked at them, really looked at them. The golden child, the narcissist, the enabler. They looked small. They looked terrified. They looked exactly like people who had just realized that the furniture in the room was worth more than they were. "The meeting is adjourned," I said. I turned and walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The sound of my brother weeping was the only closing statement I needed. The silence in the boardroom was heavy, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. My family sat in stunned paralysis, processing the fact that their scapegoat was their landlord, their bank, and their executioner. But I saw the shift in their eyes. The shock was fading, replaced by a desperate, greedy calculation. They were doing the math. I could see it on Christopher's face. He was thinking, "Okay, we lost the company, but it sold for $12 million. My 15% stake is worth nearly $2 million. I can start over. I can still be rich." My father was straightening his tie, attempting to regain some semblance of dignity. "Well," he cleared his throat, "if the sale is finalized, we should discuss the distribution of the net proceeds. I assume the wire transfers will be initiated today?" I leaned back in the chairman's chair, steepling my fingers. That brings us to the second item on the agenda. The transition. Transition? Morgan asked, her voice shrill. You said the company was sold. We just want our checks. The new owners, the private equity firm, have strict requirements for acquisition, I explained calmly. They require a clean balance sheet, no toxic assets, no unexplained liabilities, and to ensure this, they have appointed an external transition controller to audit the books before any final payouts are released. Who is the controller? Joseph asked, narrowing his eyes. Me, I said. I slid a new stack of files across the mahogany table. They weren't legal contracts this time. They were expense reports. Years of them. For the past week, I have been conducting a forensic audit of Vanguard's operating expenses, I said. And I found some fascinating discrepancies. I opened the first folder. Christopher, let's start with you. Last year, you charged $75,000 to the company card for client development in Cabo San Lucas. Christopher paled. That was a retreat. For strategy. There were no clients in Cabo, Christopher, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. There was just you, Morgan, and a 5-star resort. That is classified as embezzlement. I turned the page. And the company vehicle lease. A luxury SUV for Morgan? She doesn't work for Vanguard. That's another $1,200 a month in misappropriated funds. We needed a safe car for the kids, Morgan stammered. Then you should have paid for it, I countered. I turned to my father. He was staring at the table, refusing to meet my gaze. Joseph. Consulting fees paid to a shell company, registered in your name, $200,000 over 3 years, plus the country club membership, plus the business dinners that always seem to happen on your anniversary. I founded this company, he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. I am entitled to perks. You are entitled to a salary, I corrected him. You are not entitled to treat the operating capital as a personal slush fund. Not when you are asking investors for bridge loans to keep the lights on. I closed the file. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Here is the situation, I said. The private equity firm has a clawback clause. All misappropriated funds must be repaid before any equity is distributed. I have calculated the total unauthorized spending by the 3 of you over the last 5 years. It comes to quite a significant number. I picked up a pair of scissors from the desk organizer. I reached for the small pile of corporate credit cards that sat in the center of the table, the symbols of their status, their power, their ability to live a life they hadn't earned. When we deduct the debt you owe the company from the value of your shares, I said, picking up Christopher's platinum card, the balance is 0. I cut the card in half. Snip. Actually, I amended, picking up my father's card. It's slightly negative, but I'm feeling generous. I'll write off the difference. Snip. You're leaving us with nothing? Christopher whispered. He looked like a child who had dropped his ice cream. But the house, the tuition, we spent the payout in our heads already. Then you made a bad investment, I said. There is no payout. There are no millions. There is just the debt you accrued while pretending to be rich. I swept the plastic shards into a small pile. You wanted to run a family business, I told them. But you forgot the most important rule of business. You have to pay for what you take. I watched them crumble. It wasn't a sudden collapse like a building imploding. It was a slow, agonizing slide into reality. Christopher was the first to break. He stared at the pieces of his platinum card on the mahogany table, his hands trembling violently. The man who had sneered at me at the garden party, who had taught his son that charity cases eat last, was gone. In his place was a terrified boy who didn't know how to go home and tell his wife that the lease on the SUV was cancelled. Morgan is going to leave me, he whispered, the words leaking out of him. If I don't have the money, she's going to take Mason and leave. I looked at Morgan. She didn't contradict him. She just stared at the wall. Her face pale, calculating her own survival. She wasn't comforting him. She was already distancing herself from the failure. Then there was Joseph. My father. The patriarch who had built a kingdom on debt and bluster. He slumped in his chair, looking suddenly ancient. The redness had drained from his face, leaving it gray and slack. "Alyssa," he croaked, "you can't do this. I'm the chairman." "You were the chairman," I corrected. "Now, you're a liability." There is a concept in psychology called a narcissistic injury. It occurs when a person with an inflated sense of self-importance confronts a reality that contradicts their delusion. It isn't just disappointment. It is a complete psychological disintegration. For 30 years, my family had built their identities on a simple foundation. They were the kings, and I was the servant. They were the success. I was the disappointment. By revealing that I was the architect of their survival, I hadn't just taken their money, I had destroyed their reality. They couldn't process it. Their brains were short-circuiting because the hierarchy they worshipped had just inverted. They weren't crying because they had hurt me. They were crying because they realized I was the only one who had ever held any real power, and they had spent decades spitting on me. "Please," Joseph whispered. He reached out a shaking hand, trying to touch my arm. "Just give us the transition period. Just 6 months. Let us keep the cards. Let us figure something out. We'll pay you back." I swear, it was pathetic. The man who had threatened to cut off my tuition, who had ignored me at parties, who had treated me like a ghost, was now begging me for a credit line. I looked at his hand. I didn't pull away. I just didn't react. I felt nothing. All that was left was a profound, clinical pity. They were so small, without their props, without the company cars and the country club memberships and the titles. They were empty shells. "I can't give you the transition period, Dad," I said quietly. "Because you just spend it trying to look like you were winning. You don't know how to do anything else." I stood up. I gathered my files, the evidence of their greed and my competence. "Where are you going?" Christopher asked, panic rising in his voice. "Alyssa, wait. What do we do?" "You figure it out," I said. I walked to the door. Behind me, I heard my father sob, a harsh, jagged sound. "Alyssa!" he yelled. "I'm your father!" I paused with my hand on the handle. I didn't turn around. "I know," I said, "and that's why I'm firing you." I opened the door and walked out into the cool, quiet hallway. I left them in the boardroom with the cut-up plastic and the ruins of their ego. The air out here was cleaner. It tasted like freedom. The deal closed 3 days later. The wire transfer hit my account at 9 a.m. Sharp. $12,900,000. It was a staggering number, enough to buy a fleet of yachts or a private island, but I didn't buy any of that. I bought a house. It was a small, mid-century modern place tucked away in the mountains, 2 hours north of the city, and a lifetime away from the humidity of the lake. It had no guest room for ungrateful relatives. It had no banquet hall for performative parties. It just had a wide porch where I could drink my coffee in silence, listening to the wind in the trees instead of the whispers of people who looked down on me. A month after the sale, a letter arrived. It was handwritten. On cheap stationery, Vanguard letterhead was a thing of the past. It was from Joseph. "Alyssa," it read. "I see now that you were the one holding us up. I'm sorry I only realized your value when I had to pay for it. I read it once. I didn't feel a surge of vindication or a pang of guilt. I just felt done." I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with the old tax returns and expired warranties. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The transaction was complete. That evening, I made a simple dinner: grilled salmon and asparagus. I sat at my table, looking out at the mountains turning purple in the twilight. There was no one to serve, no one to wait for, no one to block me from the table. I took a bite. It tasted perfect. The charity case was eating first. Finally, if you've ever been the one holding the family together while they tore you apart, share this story. And tell me in the comments, what was the moment you finally decided to close your account?